They had been planning it for months. The group of 5 friends, Sarah, Jason, Chloe, Mike and Evan, were colleagues at the same office, bound together by long work hours and shared frustrations. The idea was simple, a weekend away from the grind. Just a cabin in the woods far from the city where they could unwind. No meetings, no emails, no deadlines. Friday came, and they left work early, piling into Jason's SUV. The drive out of the city was long, longer than they'd expected. By the time they arrived at the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting golden light over the forest. The cabin was a rustic, weathered thing, nestled deep in the woods, isolated, perfect. They unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. The place was everything they had hoped for, cozy, with a stone fireplace and wide windows looking out into the endless trees. It felt like they were the only people in the world. The silence around them was complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. That first night, they sat around the fire, relaxing. The crackling of logs and the warmth of the flames melted away the tension of the week. They laughed, but the laughter felt a little too loud in the quiet, as if the woods were listening, pressing in. No one mentioned it, but the silence outside the cabin had a weight to it, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're being watched. The next morning, they set out for a hike. The woods were thick, the trail narrow and hard to follow. The air was crisp, the light filtering through the trees in pale shafts. At first, they walked easily, chatting, but after an hour, the mood began to shift. There was an unease in the air. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first, like footsteps in the underbrush, always a few steps behind them. They stopped several times, listening, but every time they turned, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. It was probably just an animal. The forest was full of life, after all. But the feeling grew, that sense of being followed, watched. The hike, meant to be relaxing, became a hurried march back to the safety of the cabin. When they got back, the mood was different. The light-hearted ease of the night before had faded. There was something unsettling about the way the woods had closed in around them, and as they neared the cabin, they noticed something strange. Footprints, larger than any of theirs, pressed into the mud near the back door. The tracks appeared suddenly, as if someone had been standing there watching. No one spoke. There wasn't much that needed to be said. They all saw it, they all felt it, but they tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing, a hunter maybe, or someone passing through. It didn't explain the size of the prints, but they didn't dwell on that. They couldn't afford to. That evening the fire was lit again, and they tried to pretend everything was fine. But the wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, pressing against the windows. Shadows flickered across the walls as the flames danced in the hearth. Sarah sat closest to the window, her eyes drifting to the darkness outside. She thought she saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. She looked again. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. There was something out there. She knew it. The others felt it too, but no one spoke. No one dared. The night wore on, and the wind only grew stronger. They were supposed to be unwinding, relaxing, but the silence outside had become suffocating. The occasional creak of the cabin settling felt too loud, too close. And then came the first sound, a bang. Hard and sudden it echoed through the cabin. It came from the back door, the one they had seen the footprints by earlier. They froze, hearts racing, waiting. Another bang, this time at the front, louder, more urgent. They moved to the center of the room, instinctively huddling together. The sound of footsteps could be heard outside now, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The steps crunched over the dead leaves and something scraped lightly against the walls as it moved. Hours passed, and the sounds outside persisted. A shuffle here, a knock there. It circled again and again. The fire in the hearth began to die, leaving them in near darkness. Sarah could hear her own breathing, shallow and ragged, as the shadows thickened around them. At some point in the early hours, the banging stopped. The footsteps faded into the trees. The group stayed frozen, too terrified to move, listening for any hint of return. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. It felt like a trap, like something was waiting for them to let their guard down. They didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, they were exhausted, but alive. The morning light brought no comfort. They packed their things without a word, throwing bags into the car. No one talked about the footprints. No one talked about the banging. But there was a shared understanding that this trip was over. They had to get out of those woods. As they drove away from the cabin, Jason kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Sarah watched the trees as they sped past, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Even miles from the cabin, the woods seemed to be watching them, silent, waiting. Back in the city, things were supposed to return to normal. They went back to work, returned to the routine. But something had changed. They didn't speak to each other about what happened, but they all knew. The memory clung to them like a stain. Chloe was the first to stop showing up for work. Sick, she said, couldn't sleep. Then Jason stopped coming in, taking leave for stress. Mike and Evan followed soon after. The group that had once been inseparable slowly fell apart. Sarah stayed the longest. She tried to move on, to forget. But even she couldn't shake the feeling. The woods had followed her home. At night in her apartment, she sometimes heard it. A faint rustling, a creak at the window, a sound too soft to be anything more than her imagination. But then the knocking began.